Modern suburbs, massive areas of low-density small houses around cities with practically no other function other than residential, from which people need to travel everywhere mostly by car. You probably saw the gigantic American suburbs with huge roads, but similar ones can be found in practically the entire Western world today. But what about the former Eastern Bloc? Was that kind of living also present in there? And how did things change after the fall of communism? What was the architecture of family houses? And what about the car dependency? Let's explore all that today. Let's see the suburban reality in Central European countries of the 1990s. The attempts of recreating the sort of American dream housing in the newly free world. In the background, in our city of Altengrad, I will build 3 suburban projects, somewhat illustrating the different approaches that I will be talking about. Let's go. First, what was the background of suburban living in Central Europe before the end of communist rule in 1989? Was it all just communal high-density living in prefabricated panel blocks of flats? No, far from it, actually. In the previous episode, we discussed the garden cities movement, the principle of urban planning trend of the early 20th century that heavily inspired Central European city planners to basically kickstart modern low-density suburbia without realizing it, probably. So from the decades of 1910s to 1930s, there were already a lot of small family houses. Company development was also already a thing. Single company or some sort of a co-op would build an area with very similar looking houses, sometimes even already applying the emerging modernist trends of standardization and even prefabrication. But back before the Second World War, car was not relevant as a mean of transport that would even influence urban planning, big roads. This means that while there were already big low-density districts, and also in the spirit of garden cities, actual separate cities next to the bigger ones, they simply could not have been totally disconnected from where people needed to commute. This gradually, but slowly, started to change after the Second World War as personal cars started to be more and more popular, even in the communist countries. It is perhaps logical that such suburbs, or outskirts maybe, have been heavily continued in countries and cities where such styles were already popular pre-war. So in Central Europe, good example is Hungary. This district, but also many others in Budapest, looking at historical aerial photos, was gradually filled in during the 70s and practically all completed before 1989. In Prague, there were low-density small house districts that continued to grow with the more typical modernist cubes. But the scales of such neighborhoods are nothing compared to Budapest and obviously far, far behind cities in North America. How were these neighborhoods built? Well, actually surprisingly freely, considering the tight authoritarian rules. But on the other hand, you could not mostly rely on help from the official sources. People who wanted to build their own house practically had to do it themselves. Secure materials, of course, which was a big problem due to the frequent shortages, and secure the workforce, so usually the entire family, friends, and some local experienced builder who you found in a local pub. Something like an architectural or developer studio where an individual would go to order the new house was not a thing. So all in all, the road towards your newly built house during the communist times was not easy, but people certainly went for it and a lot were built. Just a quick statistic from Czechia. In 1989, the ratio between newly built small houses and flats in panel blocks was roughly 1:7, while today houses and flats are practically 1:1. Although in other countries this ratio will be drastically different because apparently Czechoslovakia relatively built the most panel houses in Central Europe. I would not be surprised if the ratio in 1989, Hungary for example, was something like 1:2, 1:3 maybe, in favor of panel housing from looking at historical maps, but it's just my speculation. Anyways, family houses in all the countries started to be built more from the 90s, that's for sure. In some countries, extremely more than in others. Why was that? Well, plenty of partial reasons. The panel blocks of flats quickly became the symbol of communism, seen as the evil kind of living that is not desirable in the new world, so the escape from it was seen as ideal. But the escape from cities and other apartment buildings was generally viewed as ideal too, for reasons I already mentioned before. Cities just did not look very good, especially the older historical centers were unmaintained, buildings falling apart in some cases, public spaces were not very inviting, and there were already cars absolutely everywhere because cities were not really dealing with that just yet. They were parked on historical squares, on every street, plus the new big roads cutting up city centers, with ring roads or ring highways not really there just yet. Owning your new big family house was also the new free market dream, and it was also an opportunity to show that you made it, that you took care of your family, successfully ran a business, and so on and so on. Material production was not centrally controlled anymore, it was controlled by the market. If market said there will be family houses, then that's the direction the materials will be sold into. New developer companies were created, something totally unheard of before, a place where you order your new house, pick it from a catalog, you don't have to lift a finger yourself. But of course, you have to pay all the extra people in the process. It is also the 1990s now. Car is far from crazy rare anymore. Waiting for it in line is gone. Used car market skyrocketed with old Western cars. Modernists already built big urban avenues and some highways. Shopping malls on the outskirts are being built. So overall, the way towards car-dependent suburbs is wide open for much broader sort of people. Although initially only for the richer people, the common city family started to build houses more in the late 90s, early 2000s. This also means that the 90s suburbs look richer, with bigger houses, bigger architecture, sometimes very over the top, as we will see. Alright, so that finally leads me to the reality, what was actually built and how it looked. There were basically two main approaches to constructing new suburbia. Big development by a developer company or individual private construction. It's hard to say the ratio between them, but it's safe to say that the big development is more focused on outskirts of larger, richer cities, capital cities. It's actually hard to find a newly built suburb of the 90s inside Budapest. Vast majority of what you see around the city was already done before 1989, a lot of it even before 1945. But this neighborhood in particular was added from the late 90s, and if you look closely, yeah, it shows. On this side, there's some early 2000s medium-density postmodern architecture development, which is actually quite common in Hungary around this time. Hungarians figured out early that this sort of housing does make the suburbs more efficient, manageable, sustainable, maybe, but we will talk about that some other time. Here are the family houses, and right away you can clearly see that these are certainly not poor people homes. The most striking detail, of course, are the fancy pools. But also the architecture is very different, sometimes over the top, yet clearly typically Hungarian still. Look at this house with the roof window, a dormer, specifically an eyebrow dormer, and on the other side the circular end, almost like a church. This house with a proper castle tower and also the eyebrow dormers and overall with very traditional colors. Right next to it another one with very complicated roof shape, towers of course as well. A few houses away this one with a combination of sharp edges and rounded corners. A huge rounded dormer and a bell-shaped tower which actually looks almost exactly like the Budapest's parliament. More towers on this one, another tower on this one, you get the idea, right? This place is an example of the individual construction. Each house is very unique, built on a private plot of land. It's also an example of just expanding the existing city suburbs within the city limits. Bratislava in Slovakia keeps massively growing in the last 100 years. Additionally, after 1989, borders opened and there were suddenly many more opportunities in rich Austria right next door. But it is especially the metropolitan area that keeps growing, because why settle for some pleb housing in the city, of course. So practically all towns and villages outside of Bratislava see construction boom. This is actually quite a common sight in this part of Europe, where the car suburbs mostly crystallize around the existing country towns and villages further away from the denser city, sometimes even divided from the city by forests or farm fields. So almost like a garden city, but not really, of course. Spotting a company-developed neighborhood in real life is super simple because all houses in it look similar, if not the same, with some sort of uniform layout, usually. Rusovce town is technically part of Bratislava municipality. It has the old town center along the main historical road with the typical Austria-Hungary layout of very thin and long plots with buildings perpendicular to the village's main alley. Further away are houses built throughout the 20th century, and then there is this neighborhood from the early 2000s. It's not really interesting in any way, but it's a good example of the ordinary development of this time. What is actually typical for this ordinary, earlier post-communist suburban period is the construction of larger two-floor houses, as we are still in the time when only the slightly wealthier city people could afford a house such as this. The place has maybe 2 or 3 plain types, so a very uniform look, although the houses somehow have a little traditional, postmodern, cozy feel, but they are certainly not complex. The street is very tight, which is reinforced by that uniformity, which is actually typically found in these big city new developed suburbs. The same expanded towns can be found around Prague, for example. The city itself has somewhat well-defined edges, mostly without huge low-density sprawl, because that can be found in the hundreds of independent towns and villages all around, like over here in Jesenice. Once again, it is an old village with a historical center, tiny one, that became a proper Prague's dormitory since the late 90s. We have some medium density 90s development over there, something a little younger right next to it, and then a whole bunch of single family houses, still with many empty plots of land. This is the sort of individual sprawl. Houses are not built as a single project by one developer. But despite that, some of the houses, as you can see, are practically identical. Why is that? Well, because they are catalog houses. It means the client did not order an architect to design a new house, but they picked one from a catalog of available designs offered by the construction company, thus saving money. But it's a choice. A lot of people in here decided on a unique design. More often than not, the unique houses are the larger ones because bigger architecture is likely to be paid by people ordering bigger houses, of course. And then there is this house, a mansion even, where the client clearly ordered very expensive over-the-top design. Which leads me back to talk about the crazier architecture of family houses or mansions that I first showed you in Budapest. The reasons behind it are tied to the overall reasons behind 90s suburbia, to escape the old communist grey uniformity, at least in the minds of the people. But in a lot of cases, it heavily spiraled out of control. There were many newly established businessmen who quickly got lots of money through all sorts of legal, illegal activities in the 90s. While these people were clearly skilled in obtaining cash, they did not exactly possess great taste in design. I would argue they did not really care about it at all, but on the other hand, they had a very strong urge to show the entire world that they have the money. Look at me, I made it in the new post-communist market, I'm the best, you are not. Something like that. Thus, in Czechia and Slovakia, the term business baroque was born to negatively describe such businessmen's mansions, where baroque and who knows what other elements were mashed together into a very tacky result. But even smaller family houses sometimes got the business baroque elements because the client probably thought they need to join the rich people club too, at least in looks. It's all tied to the post-communist economic societal switch. The bigger the switch, the bigger the urge and bigger the showcase of newly obtained wealth. So this effect is pretty much stronger the more east in the former Eastern Bloc you go. Back in Jesenice near Prague, this mansion actually does belong to an infamous shady businessman who got rich in the 90s quickly and, surprise, surprise, got later convicted for tax evasion and other things. So decided to build this earth wall around the mansion because these people realized maybe it's not the best to be seen. In Slovakia, there is the so-called most famous Slovak illegal building, which is, surprise again, a shady businessman's mansion. The mansion is not only the building, but also an artificial lake. There's also a huge castle wall with gates and towers around the property. Anyways, I think you get the idea, so let's try to wrap up the 90s and early 2000s attempts at suburbia, attempts to approach the Western way of living. It went hand in hand with the societal and economic changes. At first, it was something done only by the richer parts of the population who entered the business world, followed by much broader range of people later. So the real boom of single-family houses, smaller houses, happened more in the 2010s, 2020s. So we will return to it then. Architecture was quite unique, wild in this part of the world in this brief wild time period, but it quickly calmed down and suburbs somewhat got in line with the normal styles that we can see around Europe. Otherwise, there is not much else to add, since the well-known problems of suburbs obviously plagued and continue to plague the old and new Central European suburbs too. They are practically only residential, heavily car-dependent, massively clogging the city roads for commute. Public transport is clunky or impossible, especially between the detached, not large dormitory towns, or over here the so-called satellites. It's not even particularly green or quiet living, as the houses are tightly placed next to each other in the middle of nowhere farm fields. Walkability is poor, and so on and so on. I'm sure you have heard all of this before, but nevertheless, we will return to some of the suburban projects later because, of course, it's relevant to city development, the housing situation, or traffic. Now, let's take a look at what I'm building down here. So like I said in the beginning, there are 3 projects in today's episode, and each of them are illustrating something different, the things that I was talking about. So the first project is supposed to be the company development. That's the reason why it's very uniform, because I used a single pack of buildings to just make it look like it was built as a single project, because that's exactly how it was in real life. Now, in Altengrad, I actually placed it somewhat strategically, because it's going to be in the way of something I'm going to be doing in the future. So it's going to be a great opportunity to talk about some different problems that are, for example, plaguing Prague these days when it comes to the construction of certain projects on the outskirts. No spoilers though, but I suppose you can connect the dots. Anyways, the second project is supposed to show that individual construction. So there I just basically expanded some of these neighborhoods around the city, and I used a variety of different structures. So I used some of the business Baroque mansions, like I showed you the pictures of from real life, but I also used some just ordinary houses. I tried kind of to mostly use the larger houses because that is more typical of this time period. The more mundane suburbs are much later, 2010s, even today, 2020s. Anyways, that sort of area is very common in real life. It's not exactly all that super easy to spot it because it might not need to be like a newly developed area, newly established area, but just like expanded parts of cities. So that's nothing really extraordinary, to be honest. So I even just deleted some of the houses that I placed there because I just wanted to make it look like it's continually being sold to new people, and new people are going to be gradually filling in those empty plots. So yeah, so the place just looks a little scuffed at the moment because it's kind of under construction, and it's very chaotic because everybody is just building what they feel like in those places. So it's completely different than the single development. The third project is this one. That's the totally legitimate businessman's mansion next to this lake, which is totally not used to dispose of the competition. So here I just kind of went crazy. I just picked some random old looking building to really illustrate that business baroque approach, and then I just detailed the area with all sorts of things that these people might want to have on their property, which is absolutely gigantic and completely walled off by castle walls with towers. So that's the clear inspirations from Slovakia, from the pictures that I showed you from that one project. Now, obviously, these three places are nowhere near as large as in real life, or nowhere near as frequent. Yeah, sure, but I was talking about this in the last episode. I don't particularly enjoy building these sorts of areas around Altengrad, so, for illustrations purposes, I think that's absolutely fine, and here they are. In some distant future, when we reach those 2010s, 2020s, I'm of course going to add to this a little bit with the more accurate suburbs. We are going to fill this one completely and just continue somewhere else without the business baroque this time. But yeah, some other time. Now, in the next episode, we are finally going to build something much more interesting, and that's going to be, well, actually, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's going to be totally custom. It's going to be in the city center almost, and it's going to be a very visible structure once it's done. All right, so you can look forward to that one. Well, it's going to be related to public transport, all right, or like transportation in general. So tiny bit of a spoiler. Anyways, that is going to be all for today. Thanks for watching. Please do all the usual things below the video, clicking, writing, subscribing. Big thanks to channel members who are directly supporting me in what I'm doing with this channel. Huge thanks, guys. I really appreciate your support. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.